He was just a simple cowboy and thought he had pulled a regular log out of the river. But it was a chest full of bandits' gold, and from that day on, they began hunting him down. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The dawn came softly to the wide Texas prairie, spreading a pale, silvery light over the low hills and the thin ribbon of river that wound its way through the land. The world was hushed, the stillness broken only by the distant call of a mourning dove and the faint rustle of wind moving through dry grass. Mist clung to the surface of the small backwater pond where Jed Morgan had set his fish traps the evening before, veiling the black water in a soft, ghostly shroud. It was the kind of morning that belonged to men like Jed, men who had learned to rise with the first light and measure their lives not by clocks, but by the slow turn of the seasons and the moods of the land. Jed Morgan was a tall, lean man with a frame hardened by years of work under the relentless sun. His shoulders were broad, his back straight, and his skin had been darkened by dust, sweat, and wind until it seemed part of the land itself. His hat was stained from weather and years of use, its brim bent just so, a piece of shade he had learned to trust as much as his own rifle. His shirt, once blue, had faded to a pale gray from sun and countless washings in river water. His boots bore the scuffs of long miles walked across hard country. There was nothing ornamental about Jed, no silver on his belt, no polished spurs, but his movements carried the quiet certainty of a man who knew his place in this harsh world. This was the hour he loved most, the hour when the town of Red Creek still slept, when the saloon lamps were dark, when the only sounds were those of coyotes yipping far off and a lone bullfrog croaking near the reeds. He pushed his small skiff from the muddy bank, the oar dipping soundlessly into the black surface. The boat rocked gently, and he moved with it, steady and sure, the oar strokes slow and even, until he was far enough from shore that the mist swallowed everything but the faint line of the horizon. Out here he could breathe. Out here there were no watchful eyes, no questions, no debts to be remembered. Out here there was only the water, the sky, and the man who belonged to both. Jed reached the place where he had set the traps the night before. The ropes trailed into the water, slick with dew, glinting faintly in the morning light. He braced his boots against the worn bottom of the skiff and began to haul. His hands were strong and scarred from rope burns, and he knew by feel what to expect. The light drag of weeds, the stubborn jerk of a catfish, the heavy thrash of a tangle of perch. This morning the rope slid easily at first, water running off it in thin streams, but then it grew taut, as though snagged on something below. Jed's muscles bunched, his arms straining as he pulled hand over hand, the boat rocking under the effort. The weight was unusual. It did not fight as a fish would, nor sway like branches caught in the trap. It held stubbornly, as though the bottom itself resisted him. A frown furrowed Jed's face. He planted his feet more firmly, leaning back, and with a grunt, heaved. Inch by inch the rope came, heavy and unyielding. The mist seemed to close in around him, the silence deepening as though the whole pond held its breath. At last something broke the surface, a dark shape, glistening with slime, water cascading from it. Jed's first thought was that it was a log, half buried in the muck. But as he hauled it closer, the shape resolved into something unnatural. Straight edges, iron bands, a square form that could only mean one thing: a chest. He dragged it over the side of the skiff, the boat rocking dangerously under the sudden shift of weight. The chest landed with a hollow thud that echoed in the still morning air. Jed knelt over it, breathing hard, water running from his sleeves, and stared. The thing was coated in mud and moss, the wood black with age, the iron straps rusted but still whole. A thick lock, red-brown with corrosion, held the lid shut. The smell of river muck and rot filled his nostrils, but beneath it there was something else, something old, something that had slept a long time in silence. Jed's heart thudded once, hard in his chest. He had hauled many strange things from the water before: branches, a dead deer once, even the remains of an old wagon wheel, but never anything like this. This had weight not only in his hands but in the air around him, as though the pond had been keeping a secret and had finally chosen to give it up. He sat back on his heels, staring at it for a long moment. Part of him wanted to push it back into the water, to let it sink again into the mud where it had lain for God knew how many years. Part of him burned with curiosity, with the strange hunger that comes when a man feels that fate has chosen him for something. In the end, it was that hunger that won. Jed spat into the water, gripped the oars, and turned the skiff toward the bank, the chest heavy at his feet, shifting slightly with each ripple. By the time he reached the shore, the sun had climbed higher, burning away the mist and gilding the prairie in gold. The land stretched out flat and empty, save for the thin line of smoke rising from the direction of Red Creek, where the first townsfolk were beginning to stir. Jed dragged the chest onto the bank, the mud sucking at its weight, then hefted it onto his back with a grunt. The load was brutal, his muscles screaming as he staggered up the dusty path toward his shack. Each step sent pain through his shoulders, but he did not stop. The path wound past cottonwoods and mesquite, past a stand of cactus that caught the morning light. Birds scattered from the grass as he passed, and somewhere far off a steer lowed. Jed's thoughts turned to the town on the horizon, Red Creek, with its single muddy street, its saloon with the sagging porch, its blacksmith shop and church. He imagined the faces of the men there if they saw what he carried, the gleam in their eyes, the questions, the suspicions. By the time he reached his cabin, sweat ran in rivulets down his back, soaking the fabric of his shirt. He kicked open the door, stepped inside the dim interior, and let the chest fall to the floor with a thud that shook the boards. For a moment he simply stood there, breathing hard, staring at it. Then he dragged an old wool blanket from his cot and threw it over the chest, as though to hide it from the walls, from the world. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and dust, of old leather and dried herbs. Jed sank onto a stool and sat staring at the shape under the blanket, his jaw tight. He poured himself a dipper of water from the barrel and drank, but the unease did not leave him. The chest seemed to fill the room, its presence louder than any sound. Outside, the day had fully broken. He could hear the distant creak of wagon wheels on the road to town, the call of a man driving cattle toward the rail yard, the bark of a dog. Life went on as it always had, but for Jed, the morning had changed everything. There was a weight now in his cabin, a weight that pressed on him as surely as the heat of the sun. He could feel it behind him as he moved about, trying to busy himself with mending a line, with tending the fire. The blanket-covered shape loomed in the corner, silent, waiting. As the light slanted through the window and the shadows lengthened across the floor, Jed stepped outside and stood on the small porch. The prairie stretched wide and golden before him, and in the distance, faint dust rose where riders moved along the ridge. He squinted against the sun, a prickle running down his spine. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was just drovers heading toward the river crossing. But the feeling stayed with him long after he went back inside and bolted the door. That night he lay on his cot, listening to the creak of the timbers and the lonely call of a coyote. Sleep came slowly, fitful and shallow. Each time he drifted off, he dreamed of the chest, of dark water closing over it, of hands he could not see reaching for it from the deep. When he woke, the room was still, the blanket undisturbed. Yet he could not shake the feeling that he had crossed some unseen line, that whatever his life had been before, it would not be the same now. And as the first pale light of the next morning touched the edges of the prairie, Jed Morgan rose, his eyes already drawn toward the blanket-covered shape in the corner, and knew that the quiet of Red Creek would not hold for long. Morning came with a hard light that poured through the cracks in Jed's shutters and settled over the cabin like a weight. He had not slept well, waking often to listen to the night sounds, half expecting to hear footsteps outside or the soft scrape of hands against the door. When he rose, his body ached from the stiffness of a restless night. The blanket still covered the chest in the corner, but it was as if its presence had grown during the dark hours, swelling until it seemed to crowd the walls closer around him. He stood staring at it for a long moment, then forced himself to turn away. The nets still needed mending, the water still had to be fetched, the small duties of living that could not be ignored. Yet every task was done with one ear tuned to the silence, one eye glancing toward the hidden shape under the blanket. By midday, he decided to ride into Red Creek. The fish he had caught the previous morning needed trading before they spoiled, and part of him craved the distraction of human voices. He saddled his old bay horse and set off along the dusty road, the sun high and hot above. The town came into view as he crested the last rise, a scatter of low buildings huddled along a single street, their porches shaded against the glare. The saloon's bat-wing doors stood open, a piano tinkling faintly inside, and the smell of whiskey and tobacco drifted on the breeze. A couple of wagons stood outside the general store, mules hitched and stamping against flies. It was a scene Jed had seen 100 times before, yet today it felt different. There was a tension in the air, a subtle turning of heads as he rode in, as if his presence drew more notice than usual. He dismounted near the butcher's stall and carried his fish to the counter. The butcher, a heavy-set man with an apron stiff with old blood, weighed the catch with his usual slow care, but his eyes kept flicking toward Jed's face as though measuring something unsaid. A couple of women stood nearby with baskets of bread, and they leaned together, whispering behind their hands. Jed could feel their gaze prickling at his back. When he stepped back onto the street, two cowhands lounging against the saloon post straightened and watched him pass, their voices low but their smirks unmistakable. It did not take long for the talk to reach his ears. Near the blacksmith's forge, he heard one man saying he'd seen Jed hauling something heavy along the river trail the morning before. Another swore that whatever he had dragged must have been worth a fortune, else why would he keep so close to his cabin? By the time Jed tied his horse near the general store, the story had grown into a tale of buried gold, stolen long ago by the notorious Grey Jackals gang before they were run out of the territory. The gang had vanished without a trace, and for years folks had told stories about their hidden loot. Jed's name was now tied to that legend. He tried to ignore the gossip, to keep his head down and finish his business quickly, but he could feel the weight of eyes following him from porch to porch. Even the children seemed bolder, running alongside him as he walked back to his horse, daring one another to ask what he had found. One boy, no more than 10, called out loud enough for everyone to hear, asking if Jed had struck it rich. Laughter followed, but there was an edge to it, a note that was less amusement than hunger. Jed swung into the saddle without answering and rode out of town, the sound of talk following him like a cloud of flies. That evening, the unease stayed with him. He cooked a simple meal over the fire, but his appetite was gone, the bread turning to dust in his mouth. As the sun sank behind the hills and the sky turned red, he walked the perimeter of his small plot, checking the gate and the shutters, making sure the door was bolted. The land was quiet, too quiet. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs seemed muted, and he thought he caught the faint sound of a horse somewhere out beyond the mesquite stand, though when he peered into the distance, he saw nothing but the gathering shadows. Later, as the moon rose pale and round, he sat by the window with the lamp turned low, listening. Hours passed. The night deepened. Then faintly he heard it, the soft creak of his garden gate swinging open. His hand closed around the revolver on the table. His breath held. Footsteps crunched in the dirt, slow and careful. A shadow passed across the window, and Jed's heart hammered so loudly he thought it might give him away. The footsteps lingered near the porch, then receded, fading into the distance. He waited a long time before moving, the revolver still in his grip, his shirt damp with sweat though the night was cool. Sleep was impossible after that. Each board in the floor seemed to creak louder than usual. Each gust of wind against the walls made him tense. He sat awake until dawn, staring at the blanket-covered chest as though it might stir under his gaze. When the first light filtered through the cracks, he stepped outside to find the gate slightly ajar, the prints of boots clear in the dust. Someone had been there, no question. Whether they had come to look or to take, he did not know, but the thought made the back of his neck prickle. In the following days, the tension in Red Creek thickened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Whenever Jed went into town, the talk grew bolder. In the saloon, men debated loudly about whether the law should get involved, whether such a find belonged to the man who discovered it or to the whole town. Some said treasure that old must be federal property, others that it was fair game to whoever claimed it. Jed caught fragments of conversation about him as he passed. Words like selfish, hoarder, and lucky bastard floated to his ears. There were darker mutters too, talk of taking a look for themselves if Jed wouldn't share. Back at the cabin, the unease never left him. He found himself glancing toward the road each time dust rose in the distance, his hand never far from the revolver. The chest loomed larger with each passing hour, as though its very presence drew eyes from miles away. At night he lay awake, listening to the coyotes cry and wondering if the sound of hooves would follow. More than once he thought he saw a figure standing on the ridge near the trail at twilight, watching, though when he blinked the figure was gone. Jed had always been a man apart, content with his solitude. But now that solitude felt less like freedom and more like exposure. The cabin that had once been his refuge had become a trap, a place where every shadow seemed to hide a threat. He began keeping a lantern lit through the night, the revolver always loaded and close at hand. He even moved the chest once, dragging it into a different corner, as though shifting its place could shift the weight it laid on his mind. But wherever he put it, it was still there, heavy, silent, waiting. Each day seemed longer than the last. The heat pressed down, the flies swarmed, and Jed's nerves frayed like old rope. He worked less on the river and more on fortifying the cabin, checking the windows, reinforcing the door with an extra board. The simple routine of his life-mending nets, tending the fire, riding into town was now broken by constant watchfulness. Even the sound of children's laughter nearby set his teeth on edge, for he knew they were talking about him, daring one another to sneak closer to his house and peer through the cracks. The second week after he had found the chest, Jed woke one night to the distant howl of a coyote and could not fall back asleep. He sat at the table, staring at the chest, the lamplight flickering over its blanket cover, and felt something inside him tighten. He could not go on like this, jumping at every noise, waiting for the moment when curiosity turned to action. The chest had become a magnet, pulling not just his thoughts but the thoughts of the whole town. It was no longer just a secret, it was a prize. When he finally rose from the table and blew out the lamp, the stars outside seemed sharper than ever, cutting the sky into shards of cold light. The prairie stretched silent and endless before him, yet he could not shake the feeling that someone, somewhere out there, was watching. As he shut the door and dropped the bar into place, the boards shuddered faintly under his hand, and a thought came to him unbidden. This would not last much longer. Something was coming. He could feel it, the way a man feels the change of weather before a storm. And as he lay down on his cot, revolver across his chest, listening to the night breathe around him, Jed Morgan knew that the whispers of Red Creek had become shadows that moved, waiting for their chance to cross his threshold. The air that evening felt heavier than usual, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath. Jed Morgan sat on the edge of his cot long after the sun had bled from the sky, listening to the slow settling of the timbers around him. Outside, the night spread inky and deep, the stars veiled by clouds that seemed to smother the moon. The silence had a weight to it, a strange, expectant quality that set his teeth on edge. He had lived through many nights on this land, through storms that rattled the windows and winds that howled like spirits. But there was something different about this one. The air seemed to press against the walls of his cabin, and every sound, or the lack of it, struck him as unnatural. He lit the lamp low and sat at the table, the revolver laid across the boards before him, the chest looming in the corner like a shadow given form. His ears strained to catch every small sound, the rasp of a cricket, the creak of a loose board, the distant howl of a lone coyote. His hand kept drifting to the revolver, feeling the worn grip beneath his fingers. He had cleaned and oiled it earlier that day, checking the cylinder, making sure each chamber was full. Tonight felt like a night for preparedness. Time passed slowly. The lamp burned low, casting long, wavering shadows across the floor, and Jed's eyes ached from staring at the door. He thought for a moment that perhaps nothing would happen after all, that perhaps the weight pressing on him these last days was nothing but his own fear working against him. Then came the sound, faint, almost lost in the whisper of the night. But there, soft footsteps on the dirt outside. Not the quick, light steps of a child daring a prank, but deliberate, cautious, drawing nearer. Jed's breath stilled. He slid the revolver into his hand and rose soundlessly, every movement slow, controlled. The footsteps stopped. For a heartbeat, there was silence so complete he could hear the pounding of his own blood in his ears. Then the gate creaked open with a slow, drawn-out groan. The sound made the hair on the back of his neck rise. Whoever was out there was no stranger passing by. Someone had come to his door, and they were not afraid of being heard. He moved to stand beside the chest, every muscle taut, his eyes never leaving the door. The faint glow of the lamp barely lit the room, leaving the corners swallowed in shadow. Outside, the steps crunched closer, slow and heavy, until they reached the porch. The boards gave a faint, protesting squeal as weight settled on them. Then came a pause, long enough that Jed wondered if they were listening, if they could hear the ragged edge of his breathing through the thin wall. The silence broke with a sudden rattle as the door latch was tested. Once, twice. Then came a low whisper of voices, too muffled to make out the words, but enough to tell him there was more than one man outside. He could picture them crouched in the dark, conferring, their faces set, their hands ready. His grip on the revolver tightened until his knuckles ached. The pressure on the door increased, the wood groaning softly in protest. Jed's heart thudded harder. He backed a step toward the corner, placing himself between the chest and the door, and raised the revolver. Another push came, harder this time, rattling the bolt. Then with a sudden crash that split the night like a rifle shot, the door burst inward, the bars snapping from its brackets. The lamp on the table flared as the rush of air struck it, throwing wild shadows against the walls. 3 figures spilled into the room, their outlines jagged in the dim light. The first man lunged forward, eyes glinting, hands outstretched toward the chest. Jed's instincts took over. He fired once into the floorboards near the man's feet, the report deafening in the enclosed space. The intruder cursed and stumbled back, but another was already moving from the left, reaching for Jed's arm. The cabin erupted into chaos. Jed swung the revolver like a club, the butt striking the attacker's sleeve with a solid crack. The man yelped, more in anger than pain, and grappled with him, trying to wrench the gun free. Jed twisted, drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending them both crashing against the table. The lamp wobbled but held, the flame guttering wildly. The third man took advantage of the struggle, lunging toward the chest, tearing at the blanket that covered it. A red haze of fury washed over Jed. With a guttural cry, he tore free from his assailant's grip and hurled himself forward, slamming his shoulder into the intruder's side. They went sprawling together, the chest rocking under the impact but staying upright. The revolver clattered across the floor. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of fists striking, boots scuffing, and harsh breathing. Jed fought like a man cornered, every blow driven by desperation. His muscles burned, his lungs heaved, but he refused to yield. One of the attackers grabbed him from behind, pinning his arms, while another struck at him with a gloved fist. Pain burst along his jaw, but Jed drove his boot backward, catching the man behind him on the shin. The grip loosened enough for him to wrench free. He dove for the revolver, fingers closing around it just as the third man charged. Jed swung the barrel up, the sight of the black muzzle enough to halt the rush. For a long moment the room was still, broken only by the sound of harsh breathing and the hiss of the lamp. The intruders stood frozen, their chests heaving, their eyes fixed on the gun. Then one spat a curse, grabbed his companion by the arm, and backed toward the door. The others followed, their retreat ragged, angry, but quick. In seconds they were gone, swallowed by the dark outside, the sound of their boots fading into silence. Jed stood unmoving for a long time, the revolver still raised, the cabin echoing with the memory of the fight. Slowly, as the silence deepened, he lowered the weapon and let out a shuddering breath. The door hung crooked on its broken hinges, the floor littered with shards of wood, the blanket torn and thrown aside. The chest sat exposed, its damp surface gleaming faintly in the lamplight, as though mocking him. He staggered to the stool and sat heavily, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Sweat stung his eyes, blood ran from a split lip, and his hands shook with exhaustion. He looked around at the wreckage of his home, the splintered door, the overturned chair, the tracks of boot heels scuffed into the dust, and felt a grim certainty settle over him. This was no longer a matter of rumor and curiosity. The men had crossed his threshold, had tried to take what was his. Next time they might bring more men, or guns, and he might not be as lucky. He leaned forward, resting one hand on the chest. The wood was cold and slick beneath his fingers, as though it had just come from the water. He could hear the faint rattle inside as the movement disturbed its contents. That sound no longer brought excitement, but a kind of dread. As he sat there in the dim light, blood drying on his chin, Jed knew he had reached a turning point. If he kept the chest closed, it would only draw more trouble, more nights like this one until they finally took it, or killed him for it. The lamp burned lower, casting long, restless shadows across the floor. Jed stayed seated until the flame flickered out, leaving him in darkness, lit only by the pale spill of starlight through the broken door. At last he rose, his body aching, and crossed the room to slide the bar back into place as best he could. The door barely held. He dragged a stool against it and sat again, the revolver across his knees staring at the chest. Dawn found him still there, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, his face set in grim determination. The fight had stripped away what hesitation remained. The chest could no longer remain sealed, a silent beacon calling greed from every corner of the town. It was time to face whatever lay inside, to bring its secret into the light before the shadows outside his door closed in for good. Morning came gray and hollow, the light weak through the cloud cover that had gathered during the night. The air carried the clean, sharp scent of rain that had passed somewhere out on the prairie, leaving the world washed and still. Jed Morgan sat at his table, the revolver still across his knees, the chest uncovered before him. The room bore the scars of the night's struggle, splintered wood around the doorframe, a broken stool overturned in the corner, footprints tracked through the dust. His body ached with every movement, bruises blossoming under his shirt, his lips swollen and raw. Yet his mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. The decision was made. The waiting was over. He rose stiffly and crossed the cabin to gather what tools he could find. His life had never needed more than the simplest implements: a hammer to fix loose boards, a chisel long neglected and rusted from years in a corner, the small axe he used for kindling. He laid them on the floor beside the chest, the metal catching the thin light. For a moment he simply stood there, staring at the lock that had mocked him for days, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. Then he knelt, set the chisel against the seam, and brought the hammer down. The first strike rang through the cabin like a shot, the sharp metallic clang making his ears ring. Dust drifted from the rafters with the vibration. He struck again, and again, each blow echoing in the small space, each one a declaration. Sweat broke out along his brow despite the morning chill, running down his temples as he worked. The lock clung stubbornly, the iron refusing to yield to his effort. He shifted his grip and struck harder, the chisel biting at the rust, flakes of iron and old corrosion flying. It was grueling work. The muscles in his arms screamed, his shoulders burned, but Jed pressed on. His breath came in harsh grunts, the hammer rising and falling in a rhythm that soon filled the room. Outside, the prairie lay silent under the dull sky, as if the land itself listened. No one came. Perhaps the villagers heard the ringing blows from a distance. Perhaps they stood at the edge of the trail, waiting to see what he would bring forth. Jed did not care. Each strike brought him closer to ending the torment of not knowing. When his arms finally trembled with exhaustion, he set aside the hammer and took up the axe, driving its edge against the lock, prying at the iron bands that bound the chest. Chips of damp wood flew as the blade bit deep. The chest shuddered with each impact, groaning like something alive. Jed's jaw clenched, sweat dripping from his chin onto the lid. At last, with a sound like a bone breaking, the lock cracked. The sharp snap cut through the silence, leaving Jed motionless, breathless, staring at the broken iron dangling from the hasp. For a long moment he did not move. His breath rasped in the quiet, his heart pounding in his chest. Then he pressed his shoulder against the lid and shoved. The swollen wood resisted, the hinges shrieking in protest as though unwilling to give up what they guarded. With one final heave, the lid broke free, swinging back on screaming hinges. The air that escaped from the chest was thick and foul, the stench of damp and decay that had been sealed for decades. Jed turned his head, gagging, but forced himself to lean closer, his eyes straining to see within. At first he thought he had been cheated, that the chest held nothing but ruin. Bundles of paper lay inside, their edges blackened with mold, the ink blurred to near nothingness. The smell was overpowering, wet parchment and rust. But as his hands brushed aside the top layer, brittle sheets crumbling at his touch, he saw more. Tightly wrapped packets tied with faded twine, envelopes sealed with wax so old it flaked away, maps rolled and stiff from years of confinement. He lifted them one by one, setting them carefully on the table, his breath quickening as he uncovered small objects lying beneath, a compass with a cracked glass face, but a needle that still quivered faintly toward north, a pocket watch frozen at an hour long past, its case tarnished but intact, a thin chain with a locket, the metal dulled but unbroken. Jed sat back on his heels, staring at what he had laid bare. There was no gold, no glittering jewels, none of the fortune that the town seemed to imagine. Yet as he opened one of the packets and saw the writing names, dates, routes marked in careful hand, he felt something deeper than disappointment. These were records of lives long gone, of trades and agreements, of wars fought and alliances made. They were the history of the land itself, preserved by some unknown hand and hidden beneath the water until he had brought them up. He spent hours poring over the contents, setting them in neat stacks on the table, drying the worst of the damp near the faint heat of the fire. Some pages were too far gone. The ink bled into black clouds, but others held fragments that spoke clearly. He saw mention of wagon trains, of shipments sent through the mountains, of caches buried along the old military road. The map he found last made his heart pound. It showed a route winding through the nearby hills, marked with symbols and notes in a script that spoke of secrecy and caution. At its edge, a single word stood out, barely legible. Gold. As the afternoon light slanted through the broken doorway, gilding the table and the spread of papers, Jed sat motionless, the locket in his palm. The fever of greed that had consumed him these past days ebbed away, leaving a different weight in its place. This was not treasure in the way the townsfolk dreamed, but it was still power. Power to change how people saw the past, perhaps to lead them to what had been lost. Power to stir up trouble greater than what had already come to his door. He thought of the men who had broken into his cabin, of the hunger in their eyes. They would not believe him if he said there was nothing here worth stealing. They would think he was lying, that he had hidden the true wealth somewhere. The danger was not gone. It had only shifted shape. He gathered the papers again, stacking them carefully back inside the chest, though the broken lock could no longer keep them safe. He draped the blanket over it once more, though the gesture felt hollow. The secret was no longer sealed. It breathed now in his mind, in the room, and soon he knew, in the world outside. By the time night fell, Jed had not moved far from the table. He sat in the flickering light of the lamp, staring at the chest, the smell of old paper and rust clinging to him. He felt as though he had been chosen, though he could not say by whom, the pond, the land, fate itself. The weight of that choice pressed on him more heavily than any physical burden. He could not simply keep this to himself, yet to reveal it would mean opening his life to more danger, perhaps to more violence. The days that followed blurred together. Word traveled quickly that Jed had broken open the chest, and by the third morning a few men from town appeared at the edge of his property, waiting, watching. When he rode into Red Creek later that week, he was not surprised to find he was followed. Some men were suspicious, others openly hostile, demanding to know what he had found. Jed gave no answer. He had made up his mind. The chest would not remain hidden here, where every curious eye could imagine riches inside. It had to be brought into the open, shown to men who could preserve what was in it before greed destroyed it. And so, one clear morning, he loaded the chest into his wagon and set out along the trail to the nearest larger town. A few of the villagers followed on horseback, not trusting him to go alone. By the time they reached the courthouse there, a small crowd had gathered. Officials were called, and scholars from the schoolhouse came, their faces alight with curiosity. Under their watch, the chest was opened once more, its contents spread across long tables, each page handled with care. Murmurs of excitement passed through the onlookers as the scholars bent over the documents, speaking in low, reverent tones about the value of what they saw. Jed stood back, hat in hand, feeling strangely out of place. His weathered face and calloused hands seemed foreign next to the clean coats and ink-stained fingers of the men cataloging the find. Yet as they spoke of museums, of archives, of preserving the history for generations, Jed felt something loosen in his chest. This was what needed to be done. Whatever fortune had been imagined by the town, this was the real treasure. Not gold to be fought over, but knowledge to be kept. When he returned to Red Creek days later, the air felt different. Not all suspicion had vanished. Some still muttered that he must have hidden part of the hoard, that the papers were just a trick to cover the gold he had taken. But others nodded to him with respect now, offering him bread or a drink in the saloon without charge. Children followed him again, but now to ask him to tell the story of the chest, of how he had pulled it from the water. Their eyes were wide with wonder, not greed. Jed's life did not return to what it had been before. How could it? But it found a new kind of rhythm. He still rose before dawn, still pushed his boat onto the water, still hauled his nets. Yet when the mist curled low across the pond, he no longer saw only the reflection of the sky. He saw the place where the chest had lain, the dark shape rising toward him, the moment when his life had changed. He thought often of the maps and the words scrawled faintly at the edge, gold. Sometimes when the water was still, he felt the pull to follow that trail, to seek the place marked so carefully by someone long dead. Other times he thought of burning the map, letting its secret vanish once and for all, to keep the peace he had struggled to regain. One evening, as the sun sank red over the prairie and the first stars appeared, Jed sat by his small fire near the river. The map lay in his hands, the edges still stained from the water that had preserved it. He studied it a long time, his face lit by the flicker of the flames, weighing what he knew against what he feared. The world was quiet around him, the river a dark ribbon under the sky, the night carrying only the sound of crickets and the far-off howl of a coyote. When at last he rose, the fire was burning low, its embers glowing faintly in the gathering dark. Jed tucked the map into his coat, pulled his hat low over his brow, and looked out across the endless stretch of land. Somewhere beyond those hills, the rest of the story waited. Whether he would ride to meet it tomorrow or consign it to the flames, only he knew. The prairie wind stirred, cool against his bruised skin, carrying away the last smoke of the fire. Jed turned and walked back toward his cabin, his silhouette a dark, lone figure against the star-strewn sky. The weight of history still in his hands, the choice still his to make. If this story kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Click the bell icon to be the first to watch our upcoming videos. Take a moment to watch our other stories for more powerful moments still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends. You never know who might need to hear it.